David was 35 years old, with a smile that could light up a room and an energy that seemed boundless. He was the guy everyone wanted to be around. Successful career? Check. Beautiful wife? Check. Weekend adventures filled with hiking, biking, and living life to the fullest? Double check. David was living the dream, or so he thought. Hi there. I'm Goldie, and welcome to Goldie's Love Stories. I hope you enjoy today's story. David's life was a whirlwind of achievements and joy. As a top-performing sales executive, he had just closed the biggest deal of his career. His colleagues admired his drive, his clients trusted his word, and his boss had hinted at an upcoming promotion. At home, things were just as rosy. He and Sarah, his wife of 7 years, had recently started talking about starting a family. Their love was the stuff of romance novels, supportive, passionate, and seemingly unbreakable. Weekends were a blur of activity. One moment, David would be scaling a rock face, the wind in his hair and a look of pure exhilaration on his face. The next, he'd be racing his mountain bike down treacherous trails, always pushing his limits. Life is meant to be lived, he often said, not watched from the sidelines. Little did he know how those words would come back to haunt him. But dreams can turn into nightmares in the blink of an eye. For David, that blink came on a rainy Tuesday evening. He was driving home from work, excited about the surprise anniversary dinner he had planned for Sarah. The roads were slick, visibility was poor, and then screeching tires, shattering glass, and darkness. The moments leading up to the crash played in slow motion. David saw the truck coming, its headlights suddenly veering into his lane. He tried to swerve, but the wet roads made his car slide. The last thing he remembered was the deafening crunch of metal and a searing pain in his legs. When David opened his eyes, the world had changed. The sterile white of a hospital room greeted him, along with the steady beep of machines. Confusion turned to panic as he tried to move. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. That's when the doctor entered, his face a mask of professional sympathy. David, the doctor said gently, there's no easy way to say this. We had to amputate both of your legs below the knee. The words hit David like a freight train. Amputate? Legs? This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But the pain, both physical and emotional, was all too real. As the reality sank in, David's world began to crumble around him. No, 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 David muttered, his voice hoarse. This can't be happening. Doc, tell me this is a joke. Please. But the doctor's solemn face confirmed the horrifying truth. David's legs, the very legs that had carried him up mountains and across finish lines, were gone. The next few weeks were a blur of pain, medication, and overwhelming despair. David watched as his once active life slipped away. Simple tasks like getting out of bed or going to the bathroom became monumental challenges. The man who once climbed mountains now struggled to sit up without assistance. Physical therapy sessions were a special kind of torture. Each movement sent shockwaves of pain through his body. The phantom limb sensations were the worst. Feeling itches he couldn't scratch, trying to stand on legs that were no longer there. David's frustration often boiled over into anger. More than once, he lashed out at the nurses and therapists trying to help him. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional torment. David saw the look in people's eyes when they visited pity, discomfort, and sometimes even revulsion. Friends dropped by less frequently, conversations became awkward, and the silence in his hospital room grew deafening. His colleagues from work visited once, bringing a card signed by the entire office. But their forced smiles and stilted conversation made it clear. David was no longer one of them. He was now other. A broken man they didn't know how to talk to. After they left, David tore the card to shreds, tears of anger and despair streaming down his face. The worst blow came from the person David least expected, Sarah, his wife of 7 years. At first, she was there every day, holding his hand, promising it would all be okay. But as the days turned into weeks, David noticed changes. Sarah's visits became shorter, her excuses more frequent. He could see the strain in her eyes, the way she flinched when she looked at where his legs used to be. "It's okay, honey," David said one day, trying to sound upbeat. "We'll get through this together, right?" Sarah's hesitant nod and averted gaze spoke volumes. Then came the day David had been dreading. Sarah walked into his room, her eyes red from crying, a small suitcase in her hand. The words that followed shattered what was left of David's heart. "I'm sorry, David. I can't do this. I'm not strong enough. I'm leaving." David's pleas fell on deaf ears. "Sarah, please. We vowed in sickness and in health. Don't do this." But his words couldn't change her mind. And just like that, she was gone. The woman who had vowed to stand by him had abandoned him when he needed her most. David was left alone, broken in body and spirit. The days that followed were the darkest of David's life. He shut out the world, refusing visitors, barely eating. The man who once lived for adventure now couldn't see a reason to live at all. Depression wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, suffocating any glimmer of hope. Nights were the worst. In the quiet darkness, memories of his past life haunted him. He'd wake up forgetting, for just a moment, that everything had changed. Then reality would come crashing back, leaving him gasping for air, tears soaking his pillow. David's appearance began to match his inner turmoil. His once athletic frame became gaunt, his skin pale from lack of sunlight. The nurses whispered their concerns, but David was past caring. He was a shell of his former self, lost in a haze of grief and self-pity. But life has a funny way of sending help when we least expect it. For David, help came in the form of Mike, an old college buddy who refused to be turned away. Mike barged into David's room one day, armed with terrible jokes and a stubbornness that rivaled David's own. "All right, Mopey," Mike announced, pulling up a chair. "Enough of this pity party. We're getting you out of this funk." David scoffed, turning away. "Leave me alone, Mike. Can't you see I'm useless now?" Mike's response was unexpected. He rolled up his pant leg, revealing a prosthetic limb. "Useless? That's funny. I must have imagined running that marathon last year then." David's eyes widened in shock. How had he never known? As Mike shared his own story of loss and recovery, a tiny spark flickered in David's chest. Maybe, just maybe, all wasn't lost. That spark grew when Mike introduced David to a support group for people with disabilities. Suddenly, David wasn't alone in his struggle. He met people who had faced similar challenges and come out stronger. They shared their stories, their triumphs, and yes, their ongoing battles. One member, in particular, caught David's attention. Jack, a former Paralympic athlete, didn't mince words. "Look," he told David, "you can either let this define you, or you can define yourself. Your legs are gone, but you're still here. What are you going to do about it?" Those words hit David like a splash of cold water. For the first time since the accident, he felt something stir within him. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close to it, a determination to prove everyone wrong, including himself. As David lay in his bed that night, his mind raced with possibilities. He thought about Mike, running marathons with his prosthetic leg. He remembered Jack's words, challenging him to redefine himself. For the first time in months, David allowed himself to imagine a future. A different one than he had planned, but a future nonetheless. With trembling hands, he reached for the phone on his bedside table. It took him several attempts to dial Mike's number, his fingers clumsy with disuse and emotion. "Mike?" David's voice cracked. I think I'm ready to try. Can you help me?" Mike's enthusiastic response brought the first genuine smile to David's face in months. As he hung up the phone, David made a decision. He was done being a victim. Tomorrow he would take the first step, figuratively and literally, towards reclaiming his life. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. His story was far from over. Little did David know, his journey of transformation was just beginning, and it would shock everyone who thought they knew him, including himself. The road ahead would be long and challenging, filled with setbacks and triumphs. But for the first time since the accident, David felt a flicker of excitement for what lay ahead. The man who had lost everything was about to discover strengths he never knew he possessed. David's first day of intensive rehabilitation was a harsh wake-up call. As he sat in his wheelchair, staring at the parallel bars, doubt crept in. The physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Elena, sensed his hesitation. "Ready to stand up, David?" she asked, her voice a mix of challenge and encouragement. David gripped the bars, his arms shaking with the effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to pull himself up. The pain was excruciating, and after mere seconds, he collapsed back into the chair, gasping for air. "I can't do this," he panted, frustration evident in his voice. Elena's response was firm. "Can't or won't. There's a difference, David. We'll try again tomorrow." That night, lying in bed, David's mind raced. The phantom pain in his missing legs seemed to mock his efforts. Doubt whispered in his ear, telling him to give up. But as he drifted off to sleep, a small voice inside him whispered back, "Not yet." Days turned into weeks, and slowly, David began to see progress. Each small victory, standing for a few seconds longer, taking his first wobbly step with prosthetics, felt monumental. The pain was constant, but David learned to embrace it as a sign that he was alive, that he was fighting. One particularly challenging day, David found himself ready to quit. His stumps were sore, his prosthetics felt impossibly heavy, and frustration threatened to overwhelm him. As he sat, head in his hands, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Jack, the Paralympic athlete from his support group. "Tough day?" Jack asked, sitting beside him. David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "You know," Jack continued, "I had a day like this about a year into my recovery. Wanted to chuck my prosthetics out the window." David looked up, surprised. "What did you do?" Jack grinned. "I did throw them. Right out the third-floor window of the rehab center. Then I had to go down and get them, which was a real pain without legs." Despite himself, David chuckled. Jack's story reminded him that even the strongest among them had moments of weakness. It was what you did afterward that mattered. Mike visited regularly, always ready with a bad joke or a word of encouragement. "Remember," he'd say, "every step forward is a step away from where you were." As David's physical strength grew, so did his emotional resilience. The support group became a lifeline, a place where he could share his fears and triumphs with people who truly understood. Jack took David under his wing, pushing him to set goals that seemed impossible. "You were a runner before, right?" Jack asked one day. "Ever think about doing it again?" David laughed bitterly. With these, he gestured to his prosthetic legs. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Why not? I've seen guys with no legs run marathons. What's your excuse?" The idea was absurd, but it planted a seed in David's mind. What if he could run again? The thought both terrified and excited him. Months passed, and David's transformation continued. He moved out of the rehabilitation center and back into his own apartment. The first night alone was terrifying. Every creak and groan of the building sent shivers down his spine. But as the sun rose, David realized he had made it through the night on his own. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Simple tasks that once seemed impossible, cooking a meal, going grocery shopping, now brought a sense of pride and independence. David remembered the first time he successfully made spaghetti without burning the sauce or setting off the smoke alarm. He took a picture of the slightly overcooked pasta and sent it to Mike with the caption, "Gordon Ramsay, watch out." David's first attempt at running was both a disaster and a triumph. He made it barely 10 steps before falling hard on the track. But as he lay there, the rough surface pressing against his cheek, he started to laugh. He was running again, awkwardly, painfully, but running nonetheless. "You call that running?" Jack's voice called out. He had been watching from the sidelines. "My grandma moves faster than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. David's laughter grew louder. He pushed himself up, determination glinting in his eyes. "Just you wait," he called back. "I'll be lapping you in no time." With each passing day, David pushed himself harder. He joined an adaptive sports program, trying everything from swimming to wheelchair basketball. The athlete in him, long dormant, began to reawaken. Swimming proved to be particularly liberating. In the water, David felt weightless, free from the constraints of his prosthetics. He remembered the first time he dove into the pool, the cool water embracing him. As he surfaced, gasping for air, he felt a rush of exhilaration he hadn't experienced since before the accident. 1 year after the accident, David stood at the starting line of a 5K race. His heart pounded, a mix of excitement and terror coursing through him. He looked down at his prosthetic legs, now adorned with colorful designs, a gift from a local artist who had heard his story. As the starting gun fired, he took off, his prosthetic legs carrying him forward. The race was grueling, every step a battle against pain and fatigue. Halfway through, David hit a wall. His stumps were screaming in agony, and each breath felt like fire in his lungs. As he slowed to a walk, doubting if he could finish, he heard a familiar voice. "Come on, David. You've got this." It was Mike, running alongside him, having waited at the halfway point to support his friend. With Mike's encouragement, David found his second wind. As they approached the finish line, Mike fell back, letting David cross on his own. As he broke through the tape, tears streaming down his face, David felt a sense of victory he'd never experienced before. News of David's achievement spread quickly. Local media picked up his story, fascinated by the man who had lost everything only to rebuild himself stronger than ever. David found himself thrust into the spotlight, suddenly a symbol of resilience and hope. The attention was overwhelming at first. David, who had spent months in isolation, now found himself fielding interview requests and facing cameras. But as he shared his story, he realized the power it held to inspire others. Invitations to speak at schools and community events poured in. At first, David was hesitant. What did he have to offer? But as he shared his journey, he saw the impact it had on others. People facing their own challenges found inspiration in his story. He remembered speaking at a high school, seeing a young girl in a wheelchair hanging on his every word. After the talk, she approached him, tears in her eyes. "I thought my life was over when I had my accident," she said. "But you've shown me it's just beginning." David's foundation, Step Forward, began as a small idea but quickly grew. It aimed to provide prosthetics and support to those who couldn't afford them. David threw himself into fundraising, using his newfound platform to make a difference. During one such speaking engagement, David noticed a familiar face in the audience. Sarah, his ex-wife, sat in the back row, her eyes fixed on him. As he finished his speech, she approached, uncertainty written across her face. "David," she began, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say. You look amazing." David felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, but also a strange sense of peace. "Thank you, Sarah," he replied calmly. "It's been a long journey." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I made a terrible mistake, David. I was weak when you needed me most. I know it's too much to ask, but is there any chance we could try again?" Time seemed to stand still as David considered her words. A year ago, he would have given anything to hear her say this. But now, looking at Sarah, he realized something profound. He had changed, grown in ways he never imagined possible. The man she had left no longer existed. With a gentle smile, David shook his head. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but that chapter of our lives is closed. I hope you find happiness, but my path lies elsewhere now." As Sarah walked away, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had forgiven her, not for her sake but for his own. He was free. That night, as David sat on his balcony, he reflected on how far he'd come. He thought about the man he used to be successful, yes, but also complacent, taking his blessings for granted. Now, every step was a reminder of how precious life was. Training for the Paralympics was the hardest thing David had ever done. There were days when the pain was almost unbearable, when the voice of doubt crescendoed to a deafening roar. But for every moment of weakness, there was a triumph to match it. David remembered the day he broke his personal record in the 400-meter sprint. As he crossed the finish line, lungs burning and sweat stinging his eyes, he saw his coach's stunned expression. "Did I do it?" David gasped. His coach nodded, a grin spreading across his face. You didn't just do it, kid. You smashed it. But perhaps the most profound change was in David's perspective. He no longer saw his disability as a limitation, but as a unique part of who he was. It had taught him strength, resilience, and empathy he never knew he possessed. His journey had shocked everyone who knew him, his friends, his ex-wife, even himself. But more importantly, it had shown him that the human spirit is capable of overcoming any obstacle. David's story wasn't just about losing his legs. It was about finding himself, and in doing so, inspiring countless others to never give up, no matter how dark the night may seem. Tomorrow, he had another speaking engagement at a rehabilitation center. There would be people there at the beginning of their own journeys, facing the same fears and doubts he once had. David knew exactly what he would tell them. Every end is a new beginning. Every step, no matter how small, is a victory. And you are so much stronger than you know. With that thought, David headed to bed, ready for whatever challenges and triumphs tomorrow might bring. His story had shocked everyone, yes. But more importantly, it had shown that with perseverance, support, and an unyielding spirit, one could not just survive, but thrive in the face of life's greatest challenges. As he drifted off to sleep, David's last thought was of gratitude. For the strength he'd found, the people who'd supported him, and for the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow was a new day, full of possibilities, and David was ready to embrace every single one of them. Thanks for watching. How would you rate this story? Give it 1 to 5 stars in the comments and let me know what you thought. This is a brand new channel, and your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your likes, comments, and shares help this community grow, and I'd be so grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.